Greetings collectors, and welcome to today's retro game review. I wanted to take us back to the very early years of the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis today to take a look at a game that became available in the initial wave of releases. Get ready for some classic arcade style puzzle action in Zoom. Now, this was intended to be a short 5-minute episode for a very simple and self-explanatory game. However, when I came to research this one, I stumbled upon a long-running internet argument between fans of the game. How many versions of Zoom are there, and were they really all that different? Join me today as I attempt to shed some light on this old-school mystery. 1988 had already seen releases of Zoom on both the Commodore 64 and Commodore Amiga, with a conversion to DOS PC to follow. However, Zoom also managed to eke its way onto Sega's black box of blast processing the following year, 1989. Strictly speaking, the only version of the game released on a dedicated gaming console. For this episode, it's perhaps best if we start at the end with the Sega 16-bit releases and work our way backwards. Zoom is a very simple game in principle. You control Mr. Smart with the aims of outlining square tiles on the game board to complete the level. Simply run over the outline from all sides and the square will flash to show you that the job is done. It's not quite as simple as that though, as there will be a range of other enemies patrolling the board, all with slightly different behaviours. The hand will follow you, whilst others will have a much more fixed path, similar to the ghosts in Pac-Man. Now, if all this seems somewhat familiar, it's perhaps because it will put you in mind of the 1981 game Amiga that has very similar mechanics, although the graphics are radically better in Zoom. There are some updates to the formula too. You have the ability to jump and also fire a ball from behind you to delay your chasers. Throw into this the pickups such as speed, freeze and invincibility. There's a decent enough game in here. If you're lucky enough to pick up the feather, you can end the level instantly. The game is very much what it is. I have a few minor gripes that some levels become near impossible to finish as certain enemies will camp in the final remaining squares, making it near impossible to complete the level. Overall though, the graphics are decent enough for this style of game, the music is rather charming, and the in-game depiction of Mr. Smart is very friendly. The box artwork though? Well, he looks slightly more evil and devious, if anything. The big chunky outline illustrations, though, serve as a really nice throwback to the early days of the Sega Mega Drive, so there's nothing too much to complain about here. As a physical piece, the box, cartridge and manual all serve the game well. Zoom on the Sega 16-bit consoles is a tight little puzzle maze game that accomplishes everything it sets out to do. There are elements that will not be to everyone's tastes, such as the audio samples as you complete a square. There's only so many times you can hear the phrase, "Come on boy," and not wish you could disable it.
Boy. Come on boy, come on boy. Come on boy.
Overall though, Zoom on the Sega 16-bit formats is a decent little game for some arcade run-around action. As alluded to earlier, Zoom is in fact a converted game from the Commodore Amiga on license from Discovery Software, and it's this Amiga game that fans still love to argue over. It's important that I establish that the Sega 16-bit edition is a complete rework in graphics and sound. The game elements remain similar, however all previous versions share more in common with each other from a coding and execution perspective. The big question that the citizens of the internet argue over is, how many versions of Zoom are there? Hopefully I can shed some light on this. First, I will quickly get the Commodore 64 version out of the way, especially as it does give us some clues as to the lineage of the Amiga version, or versions. You will notice instantly that going from the Sega 16-bit edition to the Commodore 64 microcomputer, that there's a large step down in graphical quality, which is to be expected. Mr. Smart is now much more like Pac-Man in appearance, but generally all of the same elements are in here. The game is a little tricky to play. Zoom is the type of game that requires fast turns and a certain responsiveness to feel fair. The Commodore 64 version can feel a little spongy, but not bad for a simple maze runner. The Commodore 64 version of Zoom is certainly getting rarer these days, but not impossible to find. Overall though, Zoom feels at least playable on the Commodore 64 and still worth playing if you enjoy this style of game. The reason I'm including it here is that it can tell us a lot about the Commodore Amiga release. So here's where things get a little bit heated for the fans. For most, the Commodore Amiga is considered the main release of the game, the Commodore 64 being a downgrade from the Amiga and the Sega edition being a later edition of the game. This sets the precedent that the Amiga version is perhaps the way the game was intended to be played, at least when it was first launched in 1988. However, circulating around the internet are at least two versions of the Amiga game, and this has led to widespread confusion. Generally speaking, forum users refer to a UK or European version and a US North American version. However, for this discussion I will be referring to them as the Black Edition and the Blue Edition in reference to the main game screen colour. You can find several sites promoting the idea of a generic and specific US edition of the game. You'll also find various posts arguing over the true nature of the two versions. Take this post from the Lemon Amiga site www.lemonamiga.com. One user writes, "This European versus US version thing is a load of anyone paying just a little wee bit of attention and actually using one's brain can understand right away that the supposed Euro version is actually a pre-release, lacking intro and with more primitive looking status bar and less colours on the screen, while the US is really the final worldwide release." Strong words, but was this poster right? Others come forward with a familiar story in reference to the US Blue Screen edition. Another poster writes in reference to the US Blue edition of the game. "Looking for a crack of this version. As of 2015, none have surfaced." This leads us to believe that the Black edition is the version released and out in the wild. There is of course a third camp of gamers that dispute the premise altogether and believe in only one official retail release for the Commodore Amiga. I believe I've got to the bottom of this argument with some code hunting, and the truth is most certainly out there. First let me show you what we will call the Black Edition, a release some believe to be a European localization of the game. On first glance it looks, sounds and plays very much as the Commodore 64 edition, which we know to be the definitive version on that system. I can tell you straight off that if you've ever emulated the Zoom game for the Amiga, I'm 99% sure that this is the version that you've most likely seen whether you live in Europe or North America. This also supports Poster 2's idea that no cracked version of the Blue Edition exists. Now let's have a look at the Blue release, the release some believe to be a North American localization of the game. So what we have here are two slightly different versions of the game. I can confirm that the code certainly exists for both versions, so pretty open and closed you would have thought in terms of releases. Well, not really. Let's just dig into some of the detail though to better understand the differences. First of all, the opening sequence. The Black Edition? No opening animations at all. As for the Blue Edition, well, you can't touch this. This certainly looks to be further on in the game's development cycle compared to the Black Edition. Secondly, the opening title screen and music. The tunes are different, however, look at the sidebar. In the Blue release the design is very much that of the Commodore 64 design, a version we know that made it to market in a retail form. Now compare that to the Black Edition. Although still functional, the appearance is much simpler in design. On to the gameplay. It's fair to say that the Black and Blue editions play in a very similar way. The most noticeable in-game difference is that the Black Edition has a black background, whilst the Blue Edition has a blue background. You will notice though that certain game mechanics such as the countdown timer are missing from the Black Edition. If you don't complete squares quickly enough, then an alien that scrubs out your incomplete lines will appear, making the game even harder to complete. Just for reference, this feature is in the Commodore 64 release. The evidence is stacking up here that the edition many know as the Black or European edition is the prototype to the retail release, or just simply one of the earlier revisions of the game. What we do know is that we have physical evidence to support this Black Edition being a prototype. As far as I'm aware, I've never seen a boxed Amiga version of the game in the UK that didn't reference the US distributor. This was reasonably common for the Amiga. Games that had a single print were manufactured in one country and then distributed onwards worldwide. We know that Discovery Software, who also produced games such as Hybris in the US, had this arrangement. The second giveaway are the screenshots on the Commodore 64 edition's packaging. Now, we know that this game is relatively rare and almost certainly didn't have more than one 1988 release. Look on the box though, and you can clearly see that the Amiga version is sporting the blue background. The version that has the same sidebar as the Commodore 64 edition, and also the opening animations, leading us to conclude that the blue edition is the final retail release. This almost certainly concludes that the Commodore 64 and final Amiga release were released somewhat simultaneously, at least enough for the final colourings to be ready on the Amiga release before going to print on the Commodore 64's box. Throw into this that the blue version also has loading screens, whilst the black version doesn't, we can only conclude that the black screen game is either a prototype, earlier revision, or simply a testing edition of the game. After all, it wasn't uncommon for Amiga games to be converted to the Atari ST and vice versa during this time. The black screen edition may simply have been a stable release that the developers could port to DOS and the Commodore 64, as we know these versions did have a black background in their final revision. I can also tell you that the blue edition of the game is not easily crackable due to the software protection, and for me this is the real nub of the issue. As a result, you will see a lot of online gameplay from the emulated black version, as it was far easier to make backups in a .adf format, a file format commonly used for playing old Amiga games. If you do go searching, you are unlikely to easily find the blue retail edition in a playable format. Perhaps more on this another time, but worth mentioning as it builds to the case of copy protection being present, something that would usually only be reserved for a public retail release. If you need any more proof that the Black Edition is simply a prototype, then it's also worth checking the credits. The Blue Retail Edition lists more contributors, which should be a clear indicator of a later stage in the development cycle. Personally though, there's one thing that tells me above all others that the Black Edition wasn't initially meant for public viewing. Look what happens in the Blue Retail Edition when you lose a life. Very sad, but altogether normal. Now listen carefully to what happens when Mr. Smart is caught in the Black Edition.
W.
Did he just say... I'm not quite sure what he's actually saying, but it's certainly a sample that didn't make it into the final game. So with all that said, I'm very much in the camp that the Black Edition is no more than a well-progressed prototype, and not as some would refer to it as a UK or European edition. This is just a complete myth. This European myth is likely to have arrived via miscommunication along the way and gamers simply downloading the unfinished version of the game and emulating it. After all, the game's designer, Frank Neuhaus, is from Germany, and a host of other Europeans such as Torben Larsen from Denmark helped to work on the sound and visuals. Discovery Software International were very much a US-based publisher though. The one true retail edition is the game with the full intro, blue background, green physical box and milder language. So it looks like the irate collector on the forum was correct. With the backup files for the Black Edition in wide circulation on the internet, it is by far the most emulated and distributed of the versions. Since the copy protection on the retail release generally proved too much of an issue, it was left behind and almost totally left out of the game emulation world. This is what really led to the rise of the Black Edition being widely distributed by pirates. Hopefully, this brings us to a place where the emphasis is on those who believe in a localised European retail edition to produce a hard copy of the box. This is a piece of evidence that has not been produced to date. Until then, I'm going to call this mystery closed. Although there is a black screen version of the game, there is only one worldwide retail version of Zoom for the Commodore Amiga. However, if I've learnt anything about versions of retro games, it's that there's almost always another explanation that someone can offer up. So if I'm wrong, please let me know. My conclusions on this one are based on the evidence that I've been able to dig up. As I mentioned at the top of this episode, when I picked this game off the shelf, I had wanted to make a 5-minute episode. It turns out that Zoom has come a long way since its initial releases on the Commodore 64, Commodore Amiga, and its last revival on the Sega 16-bit consoles. From his initial Pac-Man-like appearance, to his updated form, the character of Mr. Smart and the execution of the Zoom game changed quite a bit in the small time frame between 1988 and 1989. At its roots, Zoom is a fun arcade-style maze runner with a lot of charm. I can highly recommend giving it a go if you enjoy this type of game. Whichever edition you enjoy most, happy gaming.
Come on, boy.
W.
Hello again, I hope you enjoyed today's show and thank you for the view. Remember, you can always comment, like, subscribe and find us on the social media sites below. Happy collecting!